Great creators work in isolation. They can generate ideas entirely on their own. Superstar creators are lone geniuses, right? Wrong. Great creators don't work in isolation. Instead, they borrow and they build on others' thinking. Albert Einstein once said, "The secret to creativity is knowing how to hide your sources." Let me reveal some sources to well-known creative ideas. The printing press. Gutenberg was frustrated by the tedious process of hand engraving an entire page on a single slab of wood. He borrowed ideas from two sources: coin making, which suggested a stamping process that used separate metal letters, and the wine press, which suggested the printing press mechanism. Paul McCartney's song Blackbird was based on the plight of African American women during the civil rights movement. And George Lucas, now, he was a master at borrowing ideas. Star Wars is rife with borrowed ideas. The story itself is based on mythology. This led to the hero's journey, the mentors, the prophecies, and animals with human-like features. And the dress, modern spacesuits combined with ancient-looking capes and robes. And the weapons, the lightsaber is a combination of a sword and a laser beam. Nazi Germany provided further ideas: stormtroopers, Darth Vader's helmet. The final scene in the original movie is similar to the last scene in a 1938 documentary of Hitler victoriously taking the stage at Nuremberg. Here's a more recent example. The iPhone, truly an innovation marvel, inspirational to many of us. Here's a story of one person who was inspired by the iPhone. Her name is Julie Corbett. She was a Canadian native living in Oakland, California. She worked in investment management. And in 2007, she received her first iPhone. It was inspirational for her, but not the phone. What impressed her was the packaging. The iPhone was nestled in a smooth fiber tray, biodegradable but sturdy and elegant. Despite not having a design background, she began toying with bottle designs inspired by the iPhone packaging. The design was also inspired by milk bags she used growing up in Montreal, Canada. In 2008, she filed a patent and started a company, Ecologic Brands. The bottles have a sturdy outer shell made of old cardboard boxes and newspaper. The inner pouch is made of thin plastic and holds the liquid. There are many benefits to this design. It uses 70% less plastic than conventional bottles and can be broken up easily for recycling. Ecologic has made more than 2 million bottles, and a new factory is expected to turn out 9 million bottles a year. In the last lecture, we learned brainstorming enhancing tools that provided a springboard to our thinking. In this lecture, we learn how to incorporate other people solutions, as well as nature solutions, into our situation. Now, it may sound like stealing, but T.S. Eliot said, "Immature poets imitate, mature poets steal." And Wilson Mizner, a screenwriter, said, "If you steal from one author, it's plagiarism. If you steal from many, it's research." Borrowing ideas and building off of past ideas is not cheating. In fact, it's natural. Research at the Institute of Personality Assessment and Research demonstrates this. IPAR for short. IPAR was located at the University of California at Berkeley. The director of IPAR was Donald McKinnon, a psychologist who worked during World War II, developing personnel selection procedures. And he carried on with these procedures, investigating research into highly creative individuals and what made them highly creative after World War II. The high creatives in these research studies were the best in their field, from fields like writing and science and from architecture. They were invited to Berkeley for 2 and 3 days at a time, and they were closely evaluated. A rich data set was created. personality measures. The psychologist conducted observations and biographical information was collected. I'll tell you about one classic study, a study of architects, in which they compared three groups of architects. They had the high creative architects, who were identified as being award-winning, highly innovative for their designs, moderately creative architects, and low creatives. And again, they used stringent criteria, including nominations, to identify the individuals in these groups. Now, when they assessed the data, to be sure, there were personality differences when you compared the high creatives to the moderate to the low creatives. But they found out some other interesting insights. One relates to a common developmental event that was found among the high creatives, but not among the other two groups. You see, as children, the high creatives tended to relocate geographically many times across the US, and some of them outside of the US. The IPAR team reasoned that this allowed these highly creative architects to borrow ideas from their memories, from the broad range of styles and ideas that they had been exposed to across the country and in other countries. What they had experienced as children influenced what they created as adults. Only recently have we placed such a high value on originality. In Shakespeare's time, creativity was understood to be improvement. And boy, could Shakespeare borrow ideas. Romeo and Juliet was based on a poem by Arthur Brooke. Merchant of Venice was based on a short story by Giovanni Fiorentino. Measure by Measure came from a play by George Whetstone. We're going to look at a process in the field of creativity that is based on this notion of borrowing ideas. The name of this process is called synectics. Syn, S-Y-N, comes from the Greek meaning to bring together. Now, synectics was originated by W.J.J. Gordon and George Prince, and later colleague Tony Pose. Gordon gave partial inspiration to synectics from his experiences in World War II, where he worked with an emergency group charged with removing a sunken ship blocking the Tripoli harbor. The colonel in this group imagined his mother raking the dirt in the garden, and this metaphor led to a solution. The solution was to blow up the ship and then to rake it flat so that other ships could safely pass over this ship. The synectics process is based on the use of metaphors. It also grew out of hours of analysis of audio tapes of business meetings, where they found that a non-judgmental climate paired with the use of analogies and metaphors ensured the most creative outcomes. There are four operating principles behind the synectics process. I think it's useful to examine these four principles because these four principles are very much related to this course. First of all, according to synectics, creativity is important to problem solving. We use creativity in problem solving when we're unsure how to move from where we are now to where we wish to be. When we're not clear on what strategy or solution can help us to close that gap, we refer to these as heuristic problems, meaning they're open-ended, versus algorithmic problems. With algorithmic problems, there's a known process and a single solution. You simply follow the formula and you get to the right answer. We don't use creative problem solving on algorithmic problems. Creative problem solving and the creative process we're learning in this course is designed for those more complex, open-ended problems. The second principle of synectics is that creativity is not mysterious. Rather, creativity is understandable. It's something that we can deliberately provoke. Third, creative invention is similar across all fields. In fact, we began this lecture by looking at creative process and creative problem solving and suggesting that the process that we learn in this course can be used in many, many disciplines. And finally, individual and group invention are similar. The processes that individuals use to invent is identical to the process that groups use. So let's look more closely at synectics. Synectics is a process with steps to it. We're going to focus specifically on two tools in synectics. These tools use analogies. One tool is called direct analogy. The second one we'll learn and apply is called personal analogy. Let's look at the steps to direct analogy. When I use direct analogy with groups, these are the 5 steps I take them through. I'm going to walk you through direct analogy, and I'm going to use an example. Pringles potato chips. According to the developers of synectics, Pringles potato chips were invented as a result of the synectics process. Now, I've not come across a description of how that process, step by step, was done, so this is a hypothetical walkthrough, how it might have happened. Step 1, we identify the challenge. We come up with a description of the issue that needs to be resolved. So let's go back in time. Perhaps the problem they were working on, indeed the problem they were working on, dealt with packaging chips in bags that ended up breaking the chips. The chips got destroyed, for example, in shipping. In the second step, we diverge on direct analogies. We generate situations that are similar to the challenge we're working on. So how do we pack potato chips in such a way that they don't break? Well, what are other areas, things that are similar to this, that are analogous? Well, perhaps packing a suitcase, eggs in a carton, golf balls in sleeves, bagging leaves, etc. Once we've identified a list of direct analogies, we then have to choose an analogy to work with. In the synectics example with Pringles potato chips, they chose packing leaves in a bag. They thought that was similar to packaging chips in a bag. In step 4, you then explore ideas that are suggested by the analogy that's been selected. So let's play with, imagine it's fall time and you've raked the leaves and you're putting the leaves into a bag. As you explore that and think about that situation, as they did when they were really working on this, they recognize that dry leaves take up more space. And when leaves are wet, they conform to one another, they mold together, they take up much less space in the bag. In step 5, we apply the ideas that came to our mind through this analogy. We apply it to our original challenge, and we examine what solutions might occur to us in terms of our challenge. So if our challenge is packing potato chips in a way that they don't break, what the wet leaves might suggest is a process in which the chips form to one another as they're being produced, like the leaves when they're wet. In this way, they take up less space and they're harder to break. Let's review these steps. Step 1, you identify the challenge that you need ideas. Step 2, diverge on direct analogies. In step 3, you then choose a direct analogy that comes closest to your original challenge. In step 4, you explore ideas that are suggested by that direct analogy. How was that direct analogy dealt with? How was that situation resolved? What occurred in that circumstance? And then in step 5, you take those ideas, you use them as springboards to go back to your original challenge to see what solutions might come to mind. Now, how do you find a good analogy? In order for this tool to work, we have to be effective at coming up with analogies. In synectics, they talk about a compressed conflict. That's using a pair of words to capture a contradiction. 2 words that get at the essence of the challenge that you're working on. For example, and this comes from Gary Davis's work. He wrote a book called Creativity is Forever. For example, let's imagine we've got senior citizens who are concerned about their safety. Well, as we look at that situation, the compressed conflict could be fragile strength. We use that compressed conflict because it helps us to understand the essence of the challenge to think about analogies that also involve fragile strength. So, What's fragile yet strong? What analogies come to mind? Well, glass, butterflies, plants, for example. Let's take butterflies. What ideas might we get from examining butterflies that might help seniors in terms of their concern about their safety? Well, perhaps deception. Butterflies are often camouflaged. They look stronger than they are. Blending into the environment, into the surroundings. Like the butterflies in camouflage, again, perhaps the seniors can blend into their environment. Butterflies migrate. That might suggest that seniors travel together. In this way, they may feel more secure. I don't want to pass over this too quickly because being able to generate a compressed conflict gets at the heart of what many theorists and scholars believe is a trait that highly creative people possess. That's an ability to hold opposing thoughts in their mind at the same time. Philosopher Albert Rothenberg called this Janusian thinking, after the Greek god Janus, who could look in two directions at the same time. Let's take a moment. Let's practice this skill of generating compressed conflicts. Let's return to the challenge that we used in a previous lecture, how to ensure customer loyalty for a new internet business. Think along with me. What compressed conflict is inherent in this challenge? Can you generate some compressed conflicts that help to get at the essence of the heart of this challenge? Well, perhaps one compressed conflict might be viewed as building relationships via distance. Now, how do we boil that down to two words? Well, here are some possibilities. Distant intimacy, loose bonds, unrestricted commitment. The compressed conflict summarizes the essence of the challenge. Let's take distant intimacy. If that's a direct analogy we use, we then think about other places where this compressed conflict may have been resolved successfully. Perhaps online dating services might help us. That might be analogous to our challenge of enhancing customer loyalty. So we take this direct analogy, which was based on our compressed conflict, and we ask ourselves, what does online dating suggest for ensuring customer loyalty? We're going to move on to the next tool in Synectics, personal analogy. In personal analogy, you imagine that you are the challenge. We're using empathy to place ourselves in the situation. For example, imagine your challenge is to increase sales of a candy bar. When we use personal analogy, we imagine that we're the candy bar. Look around you. What do you notice? What's in your surroundings? How do you feel as people pass you by? How do different people react to you? We record our thoughts and feelings, and then we use those thoughts and feelings to generate ideas that go after our challenge of increasing sales. Personal analogy works on a range of challenges, from selling to improving a patient's experience in a hospital to erecting a new building in a historical district. Personal analogy is about putting yourself into the challenge. Tell you what, let's try it out. Let's use the two examples I just shared with you. Let's imagine that our challenge is to improve patient experience in the hospital. Can you empathize with what this is like? Have you had this experience? Can you put yourself into that person and feel what they're feeling and think what they're thinking? And when you do this, what ideas does it give you for improving a patient's experience? Let's move away from people. This is even more of a challenge. Can you empathize with an object? Imagine an architect is going to erect a new building in a historic district. You're that new building. What would it feel like to be erected in a historic district? Look around you. What do you notice? How do you see yourself in relationship to this historic district? And as you reflect on that, as you empathize, as you put yourself into that scene, what ideas does that suggest to you? We then use those ideas to help us with the design of that building. David Cord Murray has recast the spotlight on the value of borrowing ideas. In 2009, he released a book, Borrowing Brilliance. It's a good book. I recommend it. And in that book, he provides a range of places that we can go to borrow ideas. We can borrow from competitors. We can borrow from a similar place. We can borrow from an opposite place. We can borrow from other people. Let's look at examples of each one of these. Borrow from your competitors. In 1975, Bic, a disposable pen company, introduced a disposable plastic razor blade. Gillette copied and improved the razor blade, adding a second blade. They called it the Good News Razor. Because of this kind of thinking, today, Gillette still maintains about 80% of the marketplace. Next example, borrow from a similar place. Google borrowed ideas from Library Sciences to help build their search engines. Finding a page in the World Wide Web, they likened to finding a single page in a library. Another example. While sailing on the HMS Beagle, young Charles Darwin read The Principles of Geology. Charles Lyell, the author, argued that geological formations slowly formed over time. The minute changes added up to what we see today, the shape of rivers, mountains, canyons, and such. These thoughts served as the foundation for Darwin's thoughts about change in the biological world. You can borrow from other people. Surround yourself with other creative people. Edison built a lab to do this. Edison said, "I readily absorb ideas from every source, frequently starting where the last person left off." We can borrow ideas from the opposite place. Imagine you're working on women's fashion, so you might borrow ideas from men's fashion. In fact, this is what Coco Chanel did. In the 1920s, Coco Chanel did exactly this, looking at men's fashion to inspire new women's fashion. The famous Chanel suit was fashioned after men's suits, resulting in an aesthetic combination of a knee-length skirt and a trim masculine jacket. Like Sarnoff Mednick, who created the remote associates test, David Cord Murray says the further afield one goes to borrow, the more creative. To go to a distant place to borrow. An example of a distant place is nature. Nature's been used as an analogy to solve many problems. Here are a few examples. George de Mestral went for a walk in the Alps with his St. Bernard dog, and when they returned home, they were both covered in burrs. After close examination, he saw that the way the burrs fastened themselves to him and his dog could also be used to fasten clothing, like buttons and zippers do. This led to the insight of Velcro. Analysis of termite mounds, which maintain a constant temperature in extreme heat, led to the design and construction of a building in Zimbabwe that stays cool without use of air conditioning. Qualcomm is creating rich color displays that use less energy by mimicking the photonic microstructures found in butterfly wings. Nature is an expert designer and problem solver. Humans are not the first to figure out how to build homes, make paper, resist water, or insulate. Biomimicry is a disciplined process, a disciplined creative process that intentionally draws inspiration from nature. The concept is old, but biomimicry was popularized in the 1997 book, Biomimicry, Innovation Inspired by Nature. The key focus with biomimicry is to create environmentally sensitive solutions, as nature does, as nature creates sustainable solutions. Let's look at some examples. Buildings that capture water from fog is based on an insect found in the desert that does the same. A tree structure was used to design the internal skeleton of the Opel car, mixing minimal material to gain maximum strength. When using biomimicry, the first question you ask yourself when you begin a creative problem-solving effort is, what would nature do? How would nature solve this problem? To assist you, there's a website that you can go to called asknature.org. And in this website, once you've defined your problem, you can search for analogies in nature. Now, this website's mainly based on engineering problems. Many of the examples I've shared with you, with the exception of Star Wars and the printing press, focus on a single metaphor. If you're working on a complex product, you may need multiple metaphors, like the creation of an amusement park, like Disneyland. In fact, the overarching metaphor for Walt Disney when creating Disneyland was a movie. He wanted families to feel as though they were starring in their own movie. Let's explore some of the ideas spawned by the movie metaphor. Buildings are referred to as sets. Landscaping is referred to as props, and the employees are cast members. The architectural design of the buildings in Disneyland follow a Hollywood set. The first floors are 3/4 size, the second floor 5/8 scale, and the third floor 1/2 scale. This makes movie stars feel larger than normal and give the appearance of them being larger than normal. Let's look at the other metaphors that helped form Disneyland. Nightly fireworks and cleanliness was borrowed from Tivoli Gardens in Denmark. The idea of the Matterhorn roller coaster came from a personal trip. The steam engine that circles the park was reminiscent of one that circled Electric Park in Kansas City, where Walt Disney grew up. The point: don't get wedded to just one metaphor, but borrow from many places. I'd like you to use analogy to solve a problem before our next lecture. Find a challenge. Since nature is a wonderful teacher, go to nature and find an analogy that helps you with your situation. Examine how nature solved a similar problem and see what new ideas it gives you in terms of working with your challenge. Analogical thinking is a complex form of thinking, and it takes practice. Once perfected, it will open up a rich range of ideas and solutions. Remember, borrowing and modifying is not stealing, it's just good thinking. It's good creative thinking. With this in mind, find another challenge and practice borrowing ideas, following David Cord Murray's suggestion. Systematically examine and make a list of ideas that you can borrow from other places. Look at your competitors or a rival. How did they solve a similar challenge? Look to similar places and see how similar solutions were generated for a problem that's similar to yours. How challenges have been solved in an opposite place, much like Coco Chanel coming up with a new design for women's fashion, but based on men's fashion. And finally, create a list of ideas of how other people solved this challenge. Once you have your list of borrowed ideas, examine the ones that are most promising and explore how you might modify those for your purposes. Remember, perhaps the best muse for future ideas is past ideas. Let's look at how this process works. I'm going to share with you a metaphor that I borrowed from David Cord Murray, who borrowed it from Sigmund Freud. Imagine your mind has 2 rooms, between which stands a watchman. One room is the drawing room. Here the guests, our ideas, are polite and civil. They're well-mannered. This is our conscious mind. The other room is a large banquet hall in which there's chaos. The guests here, our ideas and thoughts, are unrestrained. They're free to interact and connect. There's a great deal of energy. And the more guests in the banquet hall, the greater the possible combinations. This is our subconscious mind, our primary source of inspiration. The more guests in the banquet hall, the greater chance of an unusual combination coming together. The watchman stands in between the two rooms. The watchman is judgment. The watchman vets who can move from the banquet hall, from our subconscious, into the drawing room, our conscious mind. If the watchman is too strict, that is, our judgment is too strong, the drawing room will no longer have access to inspiration. And eventually the guests in the banquet hall, because they can't get into the drawing room, will leave or no longer interact with one another. To make the most of borrowing ideas, you should be sure your banquet hall is full of guests by giving it lots of input, and ensure judgment is not so strict, therefore allowing for novel combinations of thoughts to occur so they can eventually make it into the drawing room. As Martha Graham said, "I am a thief, and I'm not ashamed of it. I steal from the best where it happens to be." Plato, Picasso, Bertram Ross. "I am a thief, and I glory in it. I think I know the value of what I steal and treasure it for all time, not as a possession, but as a heritage and a legacy."